looking at John's use of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Just as a heads up, this class is not an all-encompassing class. There's a lot more we could say. There's a lot more written about it. Our goal for today is simply to kind of see some of the imagery, locations, people that John or God uses in the Revelation from the Old Testament. And I wrote this last week on my blog and then made a little point, I think last week in the sermon. Sometimes to understand the New Testament, you have to go backwards to the Old Testament in order to go forward. And Revelation is one of those books. It makes sense as the end of our Bibles because really it's tying the whole thing together. That's what it's doing. So, with that being said, we want to go to God in a word of prayer. And Steve, you want to lead us in opening word?
Thanks that we could come here in peace to study of thy word and to grow in the knowledge of your will for us in this world. Help us, Lord, to put aside the things of the day, to diligently study your word, to grow in an understanding of what John meant for us to know about his message and how it can help us today to better face the challenges before us. Help us, Lord, forgive us wherein we trespass. Watch over those who are able to be here. Lord, for those at home, may God bless them and keep them. And may we all profit from this opportunity to learn from your word. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thanks, Steve. A couple things I forgot. Of course, it's kind of par for the course. Afterwards, the first study guide for Revelation 1 will be in the lobby. I have about 35 copies, so take one if you really need one. I will be emailing out the PDF this afternoon, so you can print that at home. Something I will try to do, it may not be in every handout, but study helps on the back, just because I know Revelation, it's its own beast, pun intended. So normally I'll try and put study helps as pertinent to the section we're studying. So as a reminder, Revelation 1, 2, and 3, letters to the 7 churches, they read like epistles. So Ephesians, Colossians, Galatians, which means we're very familiar with that type of literature. We know how to read that. So first couple chapters, it should be familiar territory. As a reminder, Revelation will work very hard to tell us what we must know. So I'm going to answer the question next week, but somebody had asked, what are the 7 spirits of God, or what are the 7 lampstands? Well, the very last verse of chapter 1 tells us what the 7 stars and the 7 lampstands are. The book will go out its way to tell us what we must know. So just keep an eye out for that again. And if I don't put this in the lobby, throw something at me and I'll get you a copy. But I'm keeping this up here. Along those same lines, from last week's class, I did send it out. There's a few half sheets in the lobby. If you want the cheat sheet on the numbers and colors and so forth, there is a half sheet out to your left that will go over that. And I believe it was Russ, who's not here, but he had asked for a list of Roman emperors. That is in the lobby as well. I did not include all of them for obvious reasons. There was around 187 emperors over 2,000 years of the Roman Empire, so that's a lot to put on one sheet. What you do have is the first emperor Augustus through Commodus, which takes you through the end of the second century. The ones that are pertinent for study of the New Testament are probably Tiberius through Domitian. That takes you from the birth of Jesus, more or less, through the end of the first century. But anyway, some of you I saw grab this. Anyone want a copy of today's PowerPoint slides? Okay. That's why I grabbed one extra, because I didn't print off a whole bunch. Alice, you want to pass this to Chris or Chris? Sorry. Yeah. So these get emailed out, and they're uploaded on the website. I only print off copies for the people who forgot to bring it or don't have access to a printer, whatever it may be. So If you didn't get one, just talk to me afterwards and we can get that sorted out. One last thing, and I know I'm vamping right now, but if you know how to access the members section of the website, there is a shared files section. There is a file labeled Revelation Class 2023. That is where I'm also uploading class handouts, PowerPoints, and any study helps. If you don't know how to access that, please talk to me or Kurt, and we can get you set up and worked on that. Anyway, today's class. Just a reminder, comments and questions are encouraged today. Just keep in mind our rules for the road as far as making comments and questions. Be concise, be thoughtful, and be scriptural. Now, by way of introduction this morning, I'm going to show you this image. What comes to your mind when you see the Las Vegas sign or when you hear about Las Vegas? Okay. Sin. How? How do you know that? Kathleen? Right? But how do we know that? What was that? Reputation. How do you get that reputation?
Word of mouth.
Word of mouth? From doing those things that we talked about? Gambling. Back in the day, the reason Las Vegas was picked is Nevada was one of the few states that allowed gambling. And so it became a hotbed for sinful conduct and activity. So it gave rise to phrases like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, it's that kind of stuff. So today, if somebody were to say, well, Tucson's like Vegas, it's the Vegas of Arizona. It's not really, but you would immediately understand, well, Vegas is a den of iniquity, sin, a bad place to live. And this person saying it's the Vegas of Arizona. Oh, I don't want to go there. In Oregon, the colleges had their own little nicknames, and Corvallis, where Oregon State University was at, was nicknamed Cor Vegas. Because that's the only reason you went there is to engage in immorality. It was a big party school. The reason why we're starting off with this little exercise is because sometimes just a word, a name, or location mentioned to a particular audience can bring up a whole host of associations and imagery that goes with it. And what we're going to see what John does is John will use persons, places, and things from the Old Testament that would be very familiar to his audience. That all you would have to do is name the name or name the location or name the thing for these associations to come to mind. Now, of what we're going to cover today, the one that we're probably most familiar with is Jezebel. And you don't want to call your kid or be called a Jezebel, right? And we'll deal with that in just a minute, but we know the story of her and Ahab. Now, where I believe the challenge for modern readers comes to understand the book of Revelation. The lack of study of the Old Testament is no secret in the modern American church. It is a neglected portion of Scripture, and it is a section of Scripture that we kind of we'll read the histories, we'll go to Genesis for a few proof texts, and then when we get to the prophets, like, I don't know what to deal with that. What's Ezekiel seeing, and what's Zechariah all about? I'm not saying we necessarily have that issue, but it presents a situation for us that we just need to be aware of, that because we are not steeped in the Old Testament, some of the imagery and signs and symbols of Revelation seem weird to us, when really, most time John is borrowing and adapting from the Old Testament for God's new purposes in Revelation. So just keep that in mind. So, there's going to be one book recommendation I'm going to make. Again, with all book recommendations, 1 Thessalonians 5:17 holds true. Hold fast that which is good, reject that which is evil. But Brother Farrell Jenkins, who was the chair of the Bible department at Florida College for a number of years, had written an excellent book that was part of his master's thesis, John's Use of the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation. It's no longer in print, but the church library has one copy. So if you choose to check it out, please be judicious with it, and please keep it for no more than 2 weeks. A lot of the material we're going to cover today is a condensed down version of that study. So If you want to dive deeper into it that we haven't done in class, I would recommend go use that book. And if it's not there, talk to me and we might be able to work something else out. So of the 39 books of our Old Testament, 24 are alluded to in the book of Revelation. Of those 24, most of the citations come from 6 or 7 of the books. And those 6 or 7 books are Exodus, Psalms, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah. It's interesting, of all the 24 books that John makes reference to in the Old Testament, it covers the whole Old Testament. 4 of the 5 books of the law are cited, or at least alluded to. Of history, Joshua, Judges, 2 Samuel, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, and Nehemiah have allusions made to it. Both Psalms and Proverbs are alluded to. Major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, and minor prophets we have Hosea, Joel, Amos, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Zechariah, and Malachi. Today we're going to be focusing mainly on the 6 or 7 major texts that John makes frequent use of, because I think we're going to see why he does that. Or a little quick note, I'm using this accommodatively, saying John is using this. We all know that it's inspired and God's the one directing the pen, but for sake of class, I'm just going to be using that phraseology. So we want to ask why these 7 books. So if you look at the Bible, there's really 4 periods of miraculous activity, or God acting visibly in mankind. There's the period of Moses and the Exodus. There is the age of the prophets, Elijah and Elisha. There's the period of Babylonian captivity and the return. And then there's the apostolic period, which is our New Testaments. If we look at those 6 and 7 books, where those books fall, they fall within miraculous activity by God periods. Specifically Exodus, where'd it go here? Exodus, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel. Again, they see these great, fantastic acts of God in their lives. Not necessarily they are working miracles, but they see God acting visibly and decisively on behalf of his people. And if you look at the background of those books, the people of God are facing similar situations that the people of God were in the days of Revelation. Deacons, Elizabeth needs in. Thank you. And that is, they're being oppressed. They're going through hardship and tribulation and persecution, and they're wondering, is God going to do something? And more fundamentally, they're even wondering if God's even caring about them anymore. And so Exodus, that should be familiar with us, God strikes down Egypt to deliver his people. God, in the major prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, is announcing chastisement or judgment upon his people for the purpose of deliverance. And both Isaiah and Jeremiah speak of the literal overthrow of Babylon as a means of comfort for his people who are being chastised due to their sins. So as Brother Jenkins points out, the Apocalypse or Revelation makes use of the miraculous activity of the Old Testament. The books written during these periods of the Exodus and the exile are similar in that they deal with the sovereignty of God and the overthrow of opposing forces. Exodus speaks of God's judgment upon Egypt and of his care for his own people. Daniel and Ezekiel, through the use of dreams and visions, teach that God rules among the kings of the earth and determines the outcome of history. So we want to do a brief examination of these books, and just see what are the big points that John or Revelation is pulling from these books, okay? So when we talked about the apocalyptic literature, we kind of noted that Daniel is the originator, basically. God gave Daniel part of the revelation through these magnificent visions and signs and symbols in the later part of the book. And it seems that the non-inspired apocalyptic books borrowed heavily from Daniel, trying to do the same things, show what God's going to do at later times to deliver his people and overthrow the oppressors. So Daniel's the start, and we're going to be going back to Daniel a few times in our study of Revelation. So if you have free time, or just reading through Daniel, or maybe you have notes on Daniel, it'll be good to get those out again. Same thing with the other 7 books we're talking about. Just a familiarity with those books will be helpful. So it's alluded to 53 times in the book of Revelation, and for good reason. Similarities, let's see. Both John, we already talked about that. Both John and Daniel were both in exile. Both periods, the people of God are being oppressed, and each spoke about the overthrow of Babylon. Daniel, literal Babylon. John, spiritual Babylon, or the representative Babylon. And depending on your interpretation, Babylon can mean all sorts of things, but a little side note here. Revelation has its original intended meaning of who Babylon is. But as we're going to see next week, the blessing of verse 3 in chapter 1 is for all Christians who read it at any time, which means there can be several Babylons. If you act like Babylon, you're going to face the judgment of Babylon. So, contemporary example of this. Our brethren in China are facing a Babylon, the Chinese Communist government, who is seeking to oppress, persecute, and destroy the church. God's warnings about and his pronouncements of judgment of what's going to happen to Babylon applies equally to China as it did to Rome, as an appeal to apply to any oppressor throughout mankind. So again, there's the original intended audience, but God's judgments upon wicked, evil, opposing forces in the worlds of men still apply no matter what age we live in. And we can talk more about that at a later time and end of my tangent there. But they both speak of overthrow Babylon, okay? Now what's different on both of these is that Israel's in captivity due to their sins, and that's why they're suffering the affliction. Christians are suffering affliction because of their faithfulness. So they're speaking to two different groups in the sense that the reason why they're suffering is 2 different reasons. There's a lot of similarities here. So with Daniel, and I think I forgot to put this in my notes, but Daniel does see visions of the 4 beasts, and there's some imagery that gets brought over from Daniel. The image of the Son of Man from chapter 7 gets alluded to in chapters 1, 2, and 3, specifically chapter 1 when John sees Christ as a Son of Man in the heavens. So there's a lot of borrowing that same imagery and same language from Daniel there. Ezekiel is next. It's alluded to 43 times in the Revelation. And its message was to encourage the exiles by showing them God's absolute control over all things. Because think of where, well, real quick, where was Ezekiel when he received the vision? Kabar. With the exiles. They have just seen Jerusalem destroyed, and the people of God are just despondent. God's forsaken us. There is no hope. What are we going to do? And Ezekiel is shown a vision by God's messenger, his angels, to show them that no, your hope is not gone. God is going to act on your behalf one day. And so with Ezekiel, again, similar things are being borrowed there. Jenkins notes that the description of the fall of Babylon the Great seems to be modeled after Ezekiel 27. There's a lot of similarities between those 2 sections. And we're not going to dive into that right now because we're just noting the similarities and the allusions. But we will be returning back to that chapter when we get to the fall of Babylon and our study of Revelation. Again, our goal this morning is just to create an awareness that Revelation is part of this longer, not legacy, but adapting Old Testament imagery for its purposes to deal with Babylon the Great. Let's see here. Yeah, I meant to put that up. So, next, Jeremiah, not as high as Ezekiel or Isaiah, Ezekiel or Daniel, but 22 times in the book of Revelation, and its message was to announce judgment upon Israel's sins or Judah's sins, and to comfort them by announcing the judgment of their oppressors. That's the two things that Jeremiah does. You're going to be judged, but don't worry. The people I'm using to judge you and punish you will also be punished for their sins in due time. So it's interesting then that all the references in Revelation from Jeremiah come from chapters 16 through 19 when Jeremiah is describing the judgment upon Babylon. It seems that Revelation uses in reference to, in Revelation 18, announcing the judgment upon representative of spiritual Babylon, or Babylon the Great. A lot of information real quick. Questions or comments thus far? Steve?
When the inspired writer was writing, he was writing to the people he was writing to. We're having problems today, and it's our fault, because back then, one of the strongest ways to teach was to show the prophecies in the Old Testament about Christ and show them fulfilled in the New Testament. All these books that you're talking about are teeming with references to the Messiah and his coming and the same prophetic language that are used in Revelations. And so the brethren back then would have been familiar. This would not have been something that they had to learn. This would be something they already knew. And it's our deficiency that makes this more difficult, because we should be learning the same thing, because to read a prophecy 600 years before its fulfillment and then see it fulfilled in the life of Jesus is a very strong benefit to your faith.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, one very cool thing about Revelation 1 through 3, the phraseology, the time is near, the time is at hand, can also be understood that God is going to be, in John's lifetime, beginning the work of triumphing over God's enemies. And that's seen through Christ now rules on the throne. He has established his kingdom, which cannot be destroyed. And no matter who, the kingdom that Daniel saw in the vision, and we'll be going back there a little bit, but John and the original audience would have seen Revelation as a great comfort that God is beginning to act decisively in history to vindicate his people and to overthrow the oppressors. But he's not going to do it through earthly means or the way we might expect. Again, it's spiritual warfare, not earthly warfare there. So, thank you, Steve. Okay, so next we have Isaiah. It's alluded to 79 times within the book. Message is similar to that of Jeremiah. Most of the allusions come from about 5 sections of Isaiah. The first is Isaiah 6, where Isaiah sees an image of God's glory. This seems very similar to the throne room scene in Revelation. We're going to see the responses from John seeing the glory of Jesus and Isaiah seeing a picture of the glory of God. It's about the same, full of terror, falls down prostrate, and then, that's kind of a typical response when you see God's glory. And it's similar to what, again, that was the year King Uzzah died, in which Isaiah saw that. Isaiah 2 is similar to the conduct described in Revelation 6 of the wicked when the 7 seals are opened. So again, this imagery here seems to be similar. Isaiah 63 parallels that of Revelation 19 and verse 13 of the description of Jesus. Again, 19:13 talks about Jesus' garments being stained red with blood, and Isaiah 63 is the picture of the warrior God who has vindicated his people. So that imagery is similar. And just a little note here, as we noted previously, there's very few direct quotations from the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. Very few. Most of it is alluding. And an allusion is to not quote something exactly, but to invoke similar language or similar imagery for new purposes, right? Like, it's no longer a common turn of phrase in this country, but 50, 60 years ago it was. No one actually quoted the gospel accounts when Judas sold Jesus out for 30 pieces of silver. But I've heard my college professors, and it was a common turn of phrase 50 years ago, it's like, well, you sold him out for 30. Or, some sort of allusion to what Judas did as a means to say, well, you betrayed him. Something like that. So an author can allude to the Old Testament by using similar imagery or language for his audience to get that. So anyway, so Isaiah 13, 14, 21, 47, 48, when it speaks of the fall of literal Babylon, parallels that Revelation 18 to describe the defeat of the great Babylon. And then Isaiah 65, towards the second to last chapter of the book, describes the new order of things after Babylon, literal Babylon, has fallen. Well, Revelation 21 and 22 describes the new Jerusalem, the new heavens and earth, the new order of things after Babylon the Great has fallen. So the structure is similar. Again, the goals are the same. Provide comfort to God's people in the face of persecution and suffering. Let's see. Similarities between John and the Revelation. Both Isaiah and John saw a vision of God on his throne. Isaiah spoke of Babylon's fall before it happened, and John spoke of the fall of Babylon the Great before it happened. So they both are doing the same thing. And they both spoke of a new order of things after the overthrow of an evil force. Differences: John was in exile, Isaiah was not. The people of God during Isaiah's day were practicing wickedness, and that's why judgment was coming. The people of John's day were being faithful to Christ, and that's why they're facing persecution. So again, it's important to note the similarities, but also note the differences there. Now, Zechariah, this makes me chuckle, not allude to the most of times, only 15 times, and people have a hard time with Zechariah in of itself. My favorite story is of Martin Luther. Supposedly, when he wrote his commentary on Zechariah, got to the last chapter and he wrote nothing. And I go, what? And he didn't write exactly nothing. He wrote for the 13th chapter his commentary of, "For the life of me, I do not understand what the prophet is saying." And that's how he ended his commentary there. I heard Brother David McClister cite that when he was preaching on Zechariah to say, if you're confused about the imagery here, don't worry, you're in good company. But that being said, Revelation uses about 4 images from Zechariah. And these are 4 key images in the book. The lampstands in Revelation 1 seems to be borrowed from Zechariah 4. Likewise, the 7 eyes, also from Zechariah 4, is used in reference to the eyes of the Lamb in Revelation 5. Again, from Zechariah 4, the 2 witnesses, which are the 2 olive trees, Zechariah identifies that. Zechariah 4 is applied to the 2 witnesses of Revelation. And so when we dig into those symbols, we'll see that when Zechariah uses it, 2 witnesses of God. Well, what did the 2 witnesses of Revelation do? They're doing the same thing. They're witnessing to God's testimony. The 7 lampstands represent God's presence. Zechariah spells that out for us. Well, the lampstands, what's the danger if you don't remain faithful to Christ? The lampstand will be removed from your church. Oh, God's no longer going to be with you. So again, how we're seeing how sometimes we have to go backwards in order to go forwards. And then the 4 horsemen be paralleled from Zechariah 6 with the 4 chariots because the colors are the same. It's the pale, the black, and the red, and the white. I believe that's correct. Don't quote me on the last one. But the colors are the same. So, but there in Zechariah it's 4 chariots. John uses 4 horsemen, which again shows that God will allude to a previous imagery, but will adapt it to suit the present need. Okay. Now, Psalms is interesting. I forgot to put it up on the board, but Psalms have about 43 references in the book of Revelation, and we'll note them as we go along. But they're from specific Psalms. It's not just the calls to worship of like Psalm 150, for example. A lot of the times the Psalms, they're lament psalms, psalms of distress, psalms of comfort. And so there's really three reasons why Revelation quotes the Psalms, and one is for descriptions of deity. It's a very fascinating study if you want to borrow Brother Jenkins' book or dig into it yourself. A lot of the titles for God in the Old Testament are applied explicitly to Jesus in Revelation. Yahweh passages of the Old Testament are applied to Jesus. In fact, even with chapter 1, in verse 5 or 6, to the one who was, who is, and is to come, okay, that's separate from Jesus who died and the seven spirits, that's God the Father, but then interesting enough, that title is then applied to Jesus at the end of the chapter. Not that John's conflating the two, but that title belongs to Jesus as much as it does God the Father, applying those things to him. Words of praise of God, that makes sense. That's what the Psalms are designed to do. Praise God. And then thirdly, words of comfort for God's persecuted people. Because if I were to take a guess of what the most common emotion is in the Psalms, it's people not feeling okay. People being distressed by either their own sins, sins of others, the wickedness they see. Some of the Psalms get pretty negative, we would say, just because they see the wickedness in the world. Well, what did the people in John's day see? They see blatant wickedness, and they're lamenting, and they're suffering because of the sins of others and their persecution. Go figure that the Psalms would be a source of comfort. Question or comment so far? I asked that to give myself a water break because it's warm. So, anyway. Okay. Exodus. We got about 15 minutes left of class, and if you have PowerPoints, you know I'm only halfway done. So, Exodus is alluded to about 27 times in the Revelation. From the Exodus, we get the imagery of the lampstand, the trumpets, and their effects. One of the witnesses, when we read Revelation, is very similar to Moses in broad paintbrush strokes. And so it seems to be borrowing that imagery there. The Song of Moses is referenced in Revelation. Well, that's directly from Exodus 15 there. And also we get the bowls of wrath seem to be borrowed from Exodus as well. So let me make sure I have this right. Yeah. So where does Revelation draw from Exodus? And for sake of time, I can get these references to you later, but the lampstands seem to be drawn from the tabernacle furnishings of Exodus 24, verses 31 through 37, or thereabouts. The seven trumpets, if you note the effects of the seven trumpets, they're the similar effects from the 10 plagues. Sometimes one trumpet will cover two, and what were the 10 plagues? They were visible signs of judgment upon God's people's oppressors, and to show that their gods are no gods at all, right? Because if you study Exodus, each of those 10 plagues is attacking a specific Egyptian deity. That's why the second to last one, darkness, if I remember correctly, who was the chief deity of the Egyptian pantheon? Ra, the sun god, right? Right? And so to block out the sun with darkness so advanced that you could feel it, and your god Ra can't bring it back, suddenly if I'm an Egyptian, I'm thinking, maybe my gods aren't real. Maybe they're not powerful. So when God uses similar imagery in the New Testament, in Revelation, of these visible signs of judgment with the seven trumpets, it's the same message. Your gods are no gods at all. God is in control. He controls the fates of all. And that would be a sign of terror for those who are not Christians. It'd be a sign of comfort for those who are Christians, because God's acting in a visible way as he did during the Exodus. Which, if you get into it, the Exodus is a narrative that gets repeated several times throughout the New Testament. Fun little tangent, and I know I don't have time for a tangent, but I'm going to do it anyway. If you look closely at Matthew's Gospel, there seems to be a parallel to the Exodus. You have the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and then Moses gave the law. again, at the end of that wandering, will Jesus fast for 40 days and 40 nights? And then what do we read? The first sermon of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. A law given to people after a wandering, if you will. So the Exodus is a baked-in narrative, if you will, in the Bible, because it more than anything else symbolizes and shows how God acts on behalf of his people to save them and brings them into covenant. Well, that's what Jesus is doing too. He acts to save his people and bring them into covenant. God's going to act in Revelation to protect and save the people of the covenant. So, okay. I'm going to have to skip over the rest of this because we got other things to talk about. So, Old Testament imagery used in the book of Revelation. There's locations, people, and things that get alluded to. Some of these we've already talked about, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but, Babylon, for example. Well, Babylon's the instrument of God's judgment in Jeremiah. Babylon is the oppressors and the captors in books of Daniel and Ezekiel. It represents an opposing force to God's people. And even if we didn't know about apocalyptic literature or anything else like that, if you've read the Bible once through, you would see that in the prophets, Babylon was an instrument of God's judgment as an oppressor. And so it's being used in a similar way here. Jerusalem, if we read our Old Testaments, it's the most prominent city of the Old and New Testaments. It's prophesied about several times as being where the new covenant would go forth, Isaiah 2. It's also where God chose to set his presence. When David was looking for a place to build the temple, God chose Jerusalem. And so that's the main meaning behind that image in the book of Revelation. It's where the presence of God dwells. And so there'll be a contrast in later part of the book of earthly Jerusalem and heavenly Jerusalem. Earthly Jerusalem was where God was slain, Jesus. They oppressed the people. Heavenly Jerusalem stands opposed to that. It is where the true presence of God is at. And when we read the end of the book, when New Jerusalem comes down, that's showing that God will dwell eternally with his people. So that imagery there, that's where God's presence is at. Egypt, we read our Old Testament history and prophets. We know Egypt became as a symbol of bondage. The sad thing that God kept saying over and over again in the prophets is, why are you going back to Egypt for your hope? Why are you going back to Egypt for your salvation? Why are you trusting in Egypt? Because that's where they were held in slavery. Again, Exodus, big imagery there, important lessons that get carried on throughout the whole Bible. River Euphrates, think back to 5th grade history. We know the Tigris and Euphrates form the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, right? Euphrates also was the northernmost border of Israel. And the river Euphrates in the prophets became as a symbol used by God to signify where judgment was going to come. Because for Assyria and Babylon to come and invade Israel, you can't go straight across. You'll die. There's no water. You have to go up and around. And so they would cross the river Euphrates before they came down into Israel and then into Judah. In the 1st century, the Euphrates was the easternmost border of the Roman Empire. And what lay beyond? The dreaded Parthians, who had by the 1st century had already destroyed a legion and took one of the legionary banners, which for Romans, that was just the ultimate sign of shame and disgrace, that one of their banners, the golden eagle on one of their legions, would be taken. Rome was terrified of the Parthians. And so if you're a Jew or a Christian living in 1st century Israel, you know you're on the front lines if Parthia ever decides to cross over that river. So whether it's 1st century, Daniel's time, whatever, that river symbolizes where God's judgment's going to come from. Armageddon, or depending on your translation, Har-Megidon. There is no actual place in Old Testament history called that. But according to the more higher authorities, if you get into the Hebrew, it's probably a reference to the plain of Megiddo. And it makes sense when we look into Israel's history. Their fate was decided more times on that plain than anywhere else. Just a sample. Joshua defeated the kings of Megiddo here. Deborah and Barak defeated the kings of Canaan here. Solomon rebuilt the city here as one of his chariot cities. Uzziah died here. Josiah was slain by Pharaoh here, and all the nation mourned for him. And the plain had become a symbol of grief by the time of Zechariah, and you could read that in Zechariah 12 and verse 11. So it became a symbol of national grief because many kings had been lost there. Also, Israel's fate had been decided there several times. So when we talk about the Battle of Armageddon, or Harmageddon, and the grief that the whole world feels because of this battle, well, there's an Old Testament reference to it, okay, of why that's being used there. So objects, I'm going to throw those all up there real quick, and I'm almost out of time. So tabernacle, temple designated the dwelling place of God. The altar is where offerings were made to God. The ark was the physical token of the covenant in the Old Testament. John sees the heavenly ark, which the earthly one was patterned after in Revelation 11, verse 9. All the symbology or imagery from these three are carried over. God's presence, where you offer to God worship, and the physical token of the covenant. Okay? Two people are called out by name in the book of Revelation from the Old Testament. That is Balaam and Jezebel. And these come up very quickly in the seven churches. So Balaam, as Jenkins points out, is one of the outstanding examples of one who taught others to sin. The book of Numbers tells how Balak attempted to persuade Balaam, that should be Barak, to curse the people of Israel. Balaam was interested in advancing his own interests at the expense of God's people, and Balaam stands as an example of covetousness and greediness. And also, I would add to that, he stands as a spirit of compromise, because he was willing to compromise the truth about God for his own personal advancement. So, when Pergamon is told that they hold to the doctrine of Balaam, it likely means they manifested a spirit of broad tolerance and compromising with the world around them. And the motivation is probably the same. Greediness. It's because me, do not want to suffer any sufferings because of my faith. And right now, a little note here, there are Christian denominations who are doing that. The Anglican Church has pretty much thrown the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to the doctrine of marriage. The New Revised Standard Updated Edition, I'm be clear about that, decide to muddy the waters in 1 Corinthians and translate the Greek word for homosexuality as something else because they said you can't, it's hard to translate, and no, it's not. There are groups out there who want to compromise with the culture so they don't have to face any of the cultural pushback. That is holding to the doctrine of Balaam, of compromise to avoid discomfort. And then Jezebel, she taught Israel to sin by bringing in Baal worship and was blatantly wicked and unrepentant. And so, as Jenkins points, hence the name Jezebel is probably applied to the self-styled prophetess of Thyatira because she was like the Old Testament Jezebel in character. It's also important to note that Jezebel, her end was she was thrown down and devoured by dogs, and there was nothing left for her to bury. Revelation, the prophetess of Thyatira, who's called Jezebel, will be put on a bed of sickness, and she suffers the same end as Old Testament Jezebel. So in conclusion today, and I know we went through a lot of material, as Jenkins points out, one word, the name of a single city or person can bring to mind a whole host of imagery. And so John will be using a whole host of Old Testament imagery to make his points. And so if you see a name like Jezebel Balaam, use your cross-references in your Bible and go read about Jezebel and Balaam, and you'll probably get the understanding of what John's using there. Other times, you may not get the symbol immediately, and that's okay. Remember that Revelation will work hard to tell you what you must know, right? And thirdly, sometimes the meaning will be obvious. Well, there was a pale horse, and its name on Senate was Death, and hell and Hades followed after it. Well, what do you think pale means? Death, right? That's an obvious imagery there. So just being aware that John's using this is really all our goal was today. And just being aware of it will actually help us kind of identify it as we go through our study. So next week, Lord willing, we'll start Revelation chapter 1. I will have the study guide in the lobby. Appreciate your kind attention this morning. So next week we are digging into the text, and so come prepared to discuss it, come prepared with your questions, and just a reminder, just record those on those note cards so I can have a record of that, and I can guarantee I get to your questions. So thank you. We'll meet back in about 15 minutes. So.